You have just seen some of the actions of the muscles that we will view in this presentation of human musculature. We will demonstrate the muscles on the cadaver and describe their origins and insertions and briefly review some of their actions. The first group of muscles we will describe are located on the face and neck and are responsible for various facial expressions. One of these, the orbicularis oculi, encircles the orbit and eyelid and acts as the sphincter muscle of the eyelid. Forceful contraction of the entire muscle produces the action of winking. Another sphincter muscle located on the face is the orbicularis oris. Its fibers surround the mouth and blend with other muscles in the area. When the orbicularis oris contracts, it closes the lips and protrudes them, and because of these actions is sometimes referred to as the kissing muscle. The orbicularis oris also plays important roles in articulation and mastication. The muscle which produces the facial expressions of smiling and laughing is the zygomaticus major. Its origin is the zygomatic bone, and its fibers insert into the skin and blend with other muscles near the angle of the mouth. When it contracts, the zygomaticus major draws the corners of the mouth upward and outward. Located in the subcutaneous tissue of the neck is the platysma muscle, which arises from the fascia covering the pectoralis major and deltoid muscles. Some of the fibers of this broad, thin muscular sheet join with others of the opposite side, but the majority insert on the mandible and the skin, subcutaneous tissues, and muscles near the angle of the mouth and lower face. Its contraction produces the facial expressions of horror and fright, and it also tightens the skin of the neck. Lying underneath the platysma in the region of the neck is the sternocleidal mastoid. Its two heads of origin arise from the sternum and the medial one-third of the clavicle, and it inserts into the mastoid process of the temporal bone. When the muscle contracts, it pulls the head down towards the shoulder on that side, causing the chin to rotate upward toward the opposite side. When muscles on both sides of the neck contract together, the neck is flexed, resulting in forward movement of the head. The most superficial flat muscle of the abdominal wall is the external oblique. It arises from the lower 8 ribs, and its fibers travel in an oblique direction downward and forward to insert on the iliac crest, inferiorly, and to insert anteriorly by its aponeurosis into the linea alba. The external oblique works with the other abdominal muscles to compress the abdominal viscera. Other actions include rotation and lateral flexion of the trunk. Enclosed within a sheath formed from the aponeuroses of the anterior abdominal musculature is the rectus abdominis. It is a long vertical muscle lying on either side of the linea alba, which arises on the pubic crest and pubic symphysis inferiorly and inserts on the xiphoid process and the cartilages of the 5th, 6th, and 7th ribs superiorly. 3 fibrous bands called tendinous intersections cross the muscle and attach the rectus firmly to the anterior surface of the sheath. In addition to compressing abdominal viscera, the rectus abdominis flexes the trunk and is one of the major muscles acting when doing sit-ups. Located on the anterolateral chest wall is the serratus anterior. It arises from the upper 8 or 9 ribs, and its fibers can be seen interdigitating with the upper fibers of the external oblique muscle. It inserts on the vertebral border of the scapula, from the superior to the inferior angle. The serratus anterior holds the scapula against the chest wall and protracts and rotates the scapula upward. These actions are very important in reaching and pushing movements. This muscle is sometimes referred to as the boxer's muscle. Another muscle that acts on the scapula is the trapezius, which is located on the back. It is a large triangular muscle which originates on the superior nuchal line and protuberance of the occipital bone, the ligamentum nuchae of the neck, and the vertebral spines of the 7th cervical and all thoracic vertebra. Its insertion is the spine of the scapula, the acromion process, and the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle. Some of the actions that the trapezius performs include elevation, retraction, depression, and upward rotation of the scapula, and it can also assist in extension of the head. 3 of the muscles which have insertions and therefore actions on the humerus will now be demonstrated. The superficial triangular muscle, which covers the lower part of the thorax and lumbar regions, is the latissimus dorsi. Part of it arises from the lower 6 thoracic vertebral spines and lies anterior to the trapezius. Some of the muscle also arises from the lumbar and sacral vertebrae through the thoracolumbar fascia, from the iliac crest, and from the lower 3 or 4 ribs. It wraps around the body between the ribs and the humerus and inserts by its tendon into the intertubercular groove of the humerus. The orientation of the fibers allow it to pull the arm back in extension and also to adduct and medially rotate the arm. A large muscle located on the anterior chest, which is antagonistic to the latissimus dorsi, an extension of the arm, is the pectoralis major. This fan-shaped muscle has a broad origin, which extends from the medial half of the clavicle, sternum, and cartilages of the 2nd to the 6th ribs, and the aponeurosis of the external oblique. Its fibers converge to insert on the greater tubercle of the humerus. When the arm has been extended backward, the pectoralis major pulls it forward and medially rotates it. The muscle which forms the rounded shape of the shoulder is the deltoid. Fibers of the anterior part originate on the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle. The central part originates on the acromion, and the posterior part arises on the spine of the scapula. The deltoid inserts by its tendon into the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. The major action of the deltoid is abduction of the humerus, but parts of the muscle can also act synergistically with other muscles in flexion, extension, medial and lateral rotation of the arm. The most superficial muscle which lies on the anterior arm is the biceps brachii. As the name implies, it has 2 heads of origin. Both arise from the scapula and can be seen when the other muscles of the shoulder region are reflected. The long head originates above the glenoid cavity on the supraglenoid tubercle. The tendon of the short head arises from the coracoid process. The 2 heads of the biceps unite and insert by a common tendon into the radial tuberosity and through the bicipital aponeurosis, which has been removed in this specimen. The biceps brachii flexes the forearm at the elbow joint and also acts as a powerful supinator of the forearm. The major extensor of the forearm can be identified on the posterior surface of the arm. It is the triceps brachii, and like the biceps brachii, it has more than 1 head of origin. One of these, the long head, arises above the shoulder joint on the infraglenoid tubercle of the scapula. The other 2 heads, the lateral and medial heads, originate on the posterior humerus, superior and inferior to the radial groove. All 3 heads insert by a common tendon into the olecranon process of the ulna. Located on the posterior surface of the forearm are 2 muscles which arise on the humerus and insert on the carpal bones, and therefore cause movements of the hand at the wrist joint. One of these, the extensor carpi radialis longus, arises beneath the brachioradialis muscle on the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus. Its insertion is the dorsum of the base of the 2nd metacarpal. Extension and abduction of the hand at the wrist are actions of this muscle. Another muscle, the extensor carpi ulnaris, is synergistic to the extensor carpi radialis longus in its action of extension at the wrist. It is, however, antagonistic to the action of abduction and instead adducts the hand at the wrist. This muscle originates on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus and the posterior ulna. It inserts into the base of the fifth metacarpal. The large superficial muscle located between the two extensors of the hand is the extensor digitorum. It too originates on the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, as does the extensor carpi ulnaris. Distally, its tendons insert by the extensor expansion into the distal phalanges of digits 2, 3, 4, and 5. When this muscle contracts, the fingers are extended. On the anterior surface of the forearm are the muscles which produce flexion of the hand at the wrist and the fingers. The flexor carpi ulnaris is the most medial in position. Its origin is the medial epicondyle of the humerus and the posterior ulna. It inserts into the pisiform, hamate, and fifth metacarpal bones. In addition to flexion of the hand at the wrist, it is synergistic with the extensor carpi ulnaris in adduction. The most laterally located flexor of the hand is the flexor carpi radialis. It arises by a common tendon with the other flexor muscles on the medial epicondyle of the humerus and diagonally crosses the forearm to insert on the second and third metacarpals. It also works with the extensor carpi radialis longus to produce abduction of the hand at the wrist. The most superficial flexor of the fingers is the flexor digitorum superficialis. It has an extensive origin with fibers coming from the medial epicondyle of the humerus and the coronoid process of the ulna to join with additional fibers from the proximal radius. Near the wrist, the muscle divides into 4 tendons which go to the middle phalanx of the 4 fingers. As each tendon of the flexor digitorum superficialis approaches the middle phalanx, it splits and permits the tendon of the flexor digitorum profundus to pass through to go to the distal phalanx. The largest, most prominent muscle of the buttocks region is the gluteus maximus. It is superficial and overlies other gluteal and rotator muscles in the region. It originates on the ilium, sacrum, and coccyx. The muscle fibers of the gluteus maximus travel laterally in an oblique orientation and insert on the gluteal tuberosity of the femur and the iliotibial tract. This muscle is a powerful extensor and lateral rotator of the thigh. A muscle located in the anterolateral thigh region is the tensor fasciae latae. It arises from the anterior iliac crest and the anterior superior iliac spine. It is surrounded by fascial planes of tissue which blend into the iliotibial tract. The tensor assists in flexion, abduction, and medial rotation of the thigh at the hip joint. The sartorius muscle of the anterior thigh region is the longest muscle in the body. It originates primarily on the anterior superior iliac spine and travels obliquely over the thigh to insert medially on the proximal tibia. Since it crosses 2 joints in its course, it has actions at both the hip and the knee. These include flexion, abduction, and lateral rotation of the thigh and flexion of the leg. It has been called the tailor's muscle because the actions of this muscle produce the typical cross-legged sitting position characteristic of tailors. The largest muscle mass of the anterior thigh is the quadriceps femoris, which is actually 4 separate muscles. One of these muscles, the rectus femoris, originates above the hip joint on the anterior inferior iliac spine and superior lip of the acetabulum. The other three muscles have their origins on the lateral, medial, and anterior femur. The largest and most lateral in position is the vastus lateralis. The vastus medialis, which is seen more clearly in this view, arises on the medial aspect of the femur. The vastus intermedius lies underneath the rectus femoris, on the anterior surface of the femur. All four muscles have a common tendon of insertion into the tibial tuberosity by way of the patellar ligament, and as a group extend the leg at the knee. Since the rectus femoris also crosses the hip joint anteriorly, it flexes the thigh. The most superficial of the medially located adductor muscles of the thigh is the gracilis. Its origin is on the inferior pubis. It travels inferiorly to insert on the medial surface of the proximal tibia. Since it originates above the hip and inserts below the knee, it too has actions at both joints. In addition to weak adduction of the thigh, it also produces flexion of the leg. Two muscles located on the posterior thigh which belong to the hamstring group are the biceps femoris and the semitendinosus. The biceps femoris, like the biceps brachii, has two heads of origin. One of these heads, the long head, originates above the hip joint on the ischial tuberosity. It descends and is joined by the short head which arises from the lateral supracondylar line and linea aspera of the femur. The common tendon from the two heads inserts on the head of the fibula and the lateral condyle of the tibia. The semitendinosus shares a common tendon of origin with the long head of the biceps femoris on the ischial tuberosity. As the name suggests, it has a long tendon which passes medially through the knee region and inserts on the proximal part of the medial surface of the tibia near the tendons of sartorius and gracilis. The primary actions of the biceps femoris and the semitendinosus are to extend the thigh at the hip joint and to flex the leg at the knee. These actions play important roles in walking and running, and sometimes during rigorous exercise these tendons can be pulled from the ischial tuberosity, resulting in the sports injury known as a pulled hamstring. Two muscles, the gastrocnemius and the soleus, form the calf of the leg and are located posteriorly. The most superficial muscle, the gastrocnemius, is a large two-headed muscle which arises from the medial and lateral condyles of the femur. Lying underneath the gastrocnemius is the soleus, which was named because it looks like a sole flatfish. It originates from the proximal tibia and fibula. The gastrocnemius and soleus share a large common tendon, the calcaneal, or Achilles tendon, which inserts into the calcaneus. When these muscles contract, the foot is plantar flexed at the ankle joint, which results in raising the heel off the floor. This action is very important in walking and jumping. The tibialis anterior also produces movements of the foot at the ankle. This muscle lies lateral to the anterior surface of the tibia and can be palpated easily. It originates from the lateral condyle and upper half or two-thirds of the tibia and the interosseous membrane between the tibia and fibula. Its muscle fibers and tendon descend from a lateral to a more medial position to insert on the first cuneiform and base of the first metatarsal bones. Contraction of the tibialis anterior produces dorsiflexion of the foot at the ankle joint, which is antagonistic to the action of plantar flexion by the gastrocnemius and soleus muscles. Because of its oblique orientation, it can also act to invert the foot. The primary muscle used for extension of the toes is also located on the anterior surface of the leg. The extensor digitorum longus lies lateral to the tibialis anterior and arises from the proximal fibula, lateral tibial condyle, and the interosseous membrane. It descends vertically and divides into 4 separate tendons on the dorsum of the foot, which insert on the middle and distal phalanges of the 4 lateral toes. In addition to extension of the toes, it also works synergistically with the tibialis anterior to dorsiflex the foot. The peroneus longus is the most superficial muscle located in the lateral compartment of the leg. It arises from the head and proximal 2/3 of the fibula and the intermuscular septum. Its tendon of insertion travels behind the lateral malleolus of the fibula, and then it curves under the foot to insert medially on the first cuneiform and first metatarsal bones. Contraction of the peroneus longus produces eversion of the foot, which is antagonistic to the action of inversion produced by the tibialis anterior. It does, however, work in synergy with the gastrocnemius and soleus to produce plantar flexion. You have just seen a few of the muscles on the cadaver which are responsible for some of the movements our bodies perform every day. As you know, there are many muscles in the body. We have tried to present representative muscles which produce important actions. In addition, the origins and insertions were described for each muscle demonstrated.
The nervous system is responsible for controlling and regulating many activities in the human body. Some of its functions include receiving and transmitting sensory input from changes which have occurred inside and outside the body. This sensory input is then processed and interpreted by the nervous system, which subsequently affects a motor response to muscles and glands. The human nervous system also works very closely with the endocrine system in maintaining homeostasis. In this presentation on the human nervous system, we review the anatomy of the brain and the origin and pathway of the cranial nerves. In another videotape entitled The Human Nervous System, the Spinal Cord and Spinal Nerves, we discuss the anatomy of the spinal cord and the organization of the spinal nerves. Many of the major nerves which arise from the cord are also identified on our specimens.
The brain and spinal cord are covered by 3 connective tissue membranes called meninges. The dura mater is the fibrous, tough outer membrane which is continuous around the brain and spinal cord. It is a single layer around the cord, but is double layered around the brain, where it contains an outer periosteal layer and an inner meningeal layer. These 2 layers are fused together around most of the brain. However, in certain areas, the 2 layers are separated and enclose the dural sinuses. These sinuses collect venous blood from the brain and return it to the internal jugular veins. The second meningeal layer, the arachnoid, lies deep to the dura mater and is only separated from the dura by a very small subdural space. The arachnoid is a very thin and delicate membrane which has a spider web-like appearance. Projections of the arachnoid membrane, called trabeculae, connect to the deeper pia mater layer, which adheres to the underlying neuronal tissue. Lying between the arachnoid and the pia mater layers is the subarachnoid space. Cerebrospinal fluid circulates within the space to bathe and nourish the brain and spinal cord, and to protect them within the skull and vertebral canal. The dura mater has been removed in this specimen, but the glistening arachnoid layer remains, covering part of the brain's surface. The cerebral arteries and veins lie within the subarachnoid space beneath the arachnoid layer. A deep groove called the longitudinal fissure separates the cerebrum into two cerebral hemispheres. These hemispheres are derived from the embryonic telencephalon. Functions of the cerebrum include localization and interpretation of sensory input, initiation and control of motor output to skeletal muscles, and intellectual and emotional processing. The cerebellum is separated from the cerebral hemispheres by the transverse fissure. As you can see, the surface of the brain is not smooth, but is formed from a series of ridges of tissue which are separated by shallow grooves. These elevated ridges of tissues are called gyra, and the depressions or grooves between them are sulci. Two major sulci can be identified on the surface of the brain. One of these is the central sulcus, which lies between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. The precentral gyrus, the location of the primary motor cortex, and the postcentral gyrus, the location of the primary sensory cortex, are named because of their anatomical relationships to the central sulcus. Another sulcus, the lateral sulcus, is located inferior to the frontal and parietal lobes and separates them from the temporal lobe. The insula is located within the lateral sulcus and is covered by parts of the frontal, parietal, and temporal lobes. The parieto-occipital sulcus is located between the parietal and occipital lobes and can be identified in this medial view of a mid-sagittal section of the brain. Several other features of the cerebrum can also be seen in this view. One of these, the corpus callosum, is the largest and most important commissure in the cerebrum. It is a collection of myelinated fibers which interconnects corresponding areas of the two cerebral hemispheres so that both hemispheres can act as a coordinated functional unit. The cerebral hemispheres also contain the lateral ventricles. They are separated by a thin membrane called the septum pellucidum, which is present in this specimen. In this preparation, part of the septum pellucidum has been cut so that the ventricular space can be seen more clearly. The choroid plexus, which is composed of specialized blood capillaries lined by ependymal cells, produces cerebrospinal fluid and is very evident in the lateral ventricle of this specimen. The diencephalon is completely surrounded by the cerebral hemispheres, and its walls enclose the slit-like third ventricle. The thalamus is the largest component of the diencephalon. The thalamus acts as an important relay center and is the region where numerous synapses occur between neurons, which are conveying information from one part of the central nervous system to another. The hypothalamus lies below the thalamus and is located near the optic chiasm. The hypothalamus is an important control center for regulating body homeostasis and works very closely with the endocrine and autonomic nervous systems.
In this horizontal section through the cerebrum and diencephalon, we will locate some of the features that we have described and review the relative positions of the cerebral cortex, white matter, and basal nuclei. Some of the structures of the cerebrum that we have previously identified on our specimen include the longitudinal fissure, frontal lobes, temporal lobes, occipital lobes, and the insula, which is located deep to the lateral sulcus in both cerebral hemispheres. The inferior horns of the paired lateral ventricles are present and are located within the temporal lobes. The anterior horns of the lateral ventricles, separated by the septum pellucidum, and the corpus callosum can also be seen in this horizontal section. The cerebral cortex forms the surface layer of the brain. It is gray matter which is composed of neuron cell bodies, dendrites, unmyelinated axons, and neuroglia. The cerebral cortex is not smooth on its surface but is convoluted, which increases the surface area of the cortex. As previously described, these convolutions of cortex called gyri are separated by shallow grooves called sulci. The cerebral cortex contains functional areas which interpret sensory impulses, control voluntary motor activity, and integrate diverse types of information.